We have just a couple minutes for questions from the audience, and okay.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I've worked with the Street Work Project, and so a lot of the youth we work with that are going to supportive housing are struggling with serious and persistent mental illness. Not all of them were in foster care or meet the relatively narrow requirements for New York approval of foster care supportive housing. And the thing I didn't hear at all was any discussion about SSI. There was a lot of discussion about employment and work, but not about long-term SSI. And because New York requires having income, it's either going to be WeCare or SSI for a lot of clients who have schizophrenia diagnoses. I'm curious about how the programs support kids, given the high threshold for getting SSI and about 70% national denial, how you guys support them in accessing that, and how the kind of discourse around employment, whether or not that interferes with the issue of shaming that comes around getting SSI for a lot of people.
Well, in our program, we do accept young people who come to us with SSI. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the form of income only has to be employment. But once they come into our program, even if they have SSI, they're still engaged, just like every other young person in the program, around employment. And it might be employment that looks very different for them because of their SSI, but they're still expected to work at some point while they're in the program. We also have young people who are in our program who maybe don't have SSI yet, but we realize very quickly that they do need it, and we will help them through the process of getting that, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to also expect them to still work. Whether that means 10 hours a week, that's fine, but we want them to be engaged in something so they're not just in the building all day, and because that for them also feels isolating. We find often that the young people who are SSI and aren't working, they feel a little bit out of the loop because 75% of the rest of the young people are at work during the day, and they find themselves to be alone in the program.
Piggyback off of that, just real quick. Actually, some of our tenants, I don't know the number offhand, actually have SSI, but I think in terms of the idea of work, really helps, the way we look at work is it really helps people's sense of self-worth. And because we don't want them to isolate, and that can lead to depression. So even if it is 5 hours a week, and actually with SSI benefits, you can work without affecting your benefits. So we work very closely with each tenant. Each tenant has a case manager to really assess kind of what their individual needs are. So if it's SSI, whether it's applying or they have it already, we'll work with that tenant.
Okay, we can take another question. Okay. Yeah.
My question is about this transitional period from 18 to 25 or 26 and experimenting and developing versus teaching the responsibility related to what happens after 26 and 27. What is the role of allowing for experimentation and testing limits, but how do you make the transition into stopping that when it comes to what comes next?
I'm glad you asked that question because as the other speakers were presenting, one issue for foster kids that came up that we at ACS frequently hear as a frustration from our providers who provide services to young people who are 16 to 18 or 16 to 20 is that they are struggling with how to provide discipline to young people in both residential and foster care settings without having calls made to the state central register on them. And it may, I know, as a former children's attorney, our young people in care all have lawyers, and some of them are great advocates for their clients and will instruct their clients, if anything happens to you, you know where to reach me, and of course our young people should be treated respectfully and well, but a lot of the reasons why young people end up in transitional housing and don't know how to fend for themselves is because our providers struggle with how to allow them to be independent without treating them too much like adults because they're supposed to be fostering them. And we haven't mastered how to do that very well. Some of our providers are terrific at it, others aren't so terrific at it, and there isn't a lot of latitude because they're abused and neglected kids. They're not delinquents, thank goodness. Some of them have been in both systems, our crossover youth. But your question is great, because before we get to 25 to 28, they're 16 to 20, and we're not really sure how to discipline them like you would your own kids, because we're not so much allowed to. And I think it's a real struggle for us and for our providers.
You know, but even more than discipline, I think the question of, consequences is broader than that.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's
in
the-
this
that's the
in
right
this
word.
in this
That's
school
the
of
right
hard
word.
knocks, where you make a mistake and you fall down and you pick yourself up and you start all over again, we don't always do that with our young people who are in our care. We protect kids from their own mistakes also, and so there's a balance. So just like any typically developing adolescent, or the fine line between accepting responsibility for the consequences of what you do and making sure that the kid's not walking into traffic. I mean, it's a fine line. So consequences are not just about discipline. I mean, I'm sorry, Ron, but they're not just about discipline.
No,
but,
I think you're using the right word.
But
You
it's
are.
really about how you learn to live in the world. Living is sort of like an experiment at that age, right? So you push your limits, you do, it's like you are your own personal laboratory, right? And so how do you sort of, create a structure that allows that to go on to a point? And then what are the constraints that you can apply to somebody else's life to help them make better choices? And so some of that is intervention, a lot of that is relationship. I mean, a lot of that has to be done in a kind of interpersonal way or through a peer culture. That's really how people learn in the world.
Yeah, I mean, and underlying all of that, of course, which is so much of, and I tried to reference it, is this whole concept of our kids suffering necessarily from some trauma, and that impacting on their capacity to trust, which makes figuring out how to impart consequences difficult for them, because they're not trusting kids, and they're not trusting for very good reason. And so you need foster homes, foster parents who are extra skilled at developing trust with our kids. And, I confess that we are not, it takes more than ACS to recruit great foster parents. It takes New York City to recruit great foster parents who really are going to care for our young people and want to develop trust with them. Families are obviously the best first option.
I think also kind of hand in hand with consequences is also modeling. We really take the approach of like a strengths-based perspective, where we want to really, so a few things. We want to help them understand that they have strengths, and that they can thrive. And if they fall down and make mistakes, we want them to learn from it. So it's not that we're going to kick them out or think any less of them. However, we feel that the staff and also the other tenants in the building can be a wonderful way to model really kind of more appropriate behavior that will help them become more successful in the real world, the bigger world. So we don't think of consequences as much because we're dealing with them kind of more of on adult basis. We look at modeling, and that has been really essential in working with that with our young adults.
Okay,
Quickly, our peer culture too at the foyer is the same way. The young people spend a lot of time policing each other and letting each other know what is not accepted in the program, and not just by the staff, but even by each other. And that helps keep things at bay a lot of the time.